influences for pots, they're not very direct really. I remember seeing fantastic English medieval pots and being very excited by those, very simple forms. And I think in my functional ware that we've been making over the years, they're very simple forms. And I think the reason I'm drawn to that is because the surface of the soda glaze is so dynamic that too much decoration for me, you don't need to decorate it, it decorates itself. Or the fire does that. And for me, simpler forms are best for that. But I think when it came to sort of making more one-off pieces, some of the pieces that I made in the past, they're definitely inspired by kind of archaeological kind of stuff, you know, dug out, found things, you know, rather than directly. I really enjoy making tea jars actually, because I think they allow you to do something quite individual with each one really. You know, the different kind of marks that I make on things with these ledges really accentuate the glaze and the form, I think. And I'm not really a decorator at all. I don't decorate pots much. The most you'll ever get out of me decoration-wise is usually a kind of fairly spontaneous sort of mark. And so I would say, you know, I'm very much I'm a mark maker, not a decorator. You know, I think these kind of forms allow you to put that into practice, really. You know, it wouldn't necessarily work on other forms so well. Making chans is kind of where it started for me with all this sort of thing, because it's very much hand cutting, you know, which is very different from the way that I made pots, which was, you know, production stuff and then, you know, using a metal tool to turn things, you know, using a wooden tool to hand cut things completely changes the way that you work, you know, and lots of spontaneity of the marks that you get from using the tool you know, happen. It's much more likely to happen with a tool like that than it is with sort of a metal turning tool, and you know, you're trying to get precision, you know. But I don't think I am that kind of person anyway. I'm not terribly accurate and precise about things. It's not to say I can't make things the same, I can. But you know, I prefer to respond to the clay itself or to the piece itself as you go on, you know. I don't want everything the same. Because I do this really kind of quite vigorously, for want of a better word, it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, because it's quite, you know, sometimes I'll go a bit too heavy on it. And because I want them to be fairly spontaneous, you know, some you miss, some you don't. But some interesting things happen, like you got that corner there, you know, so whether we can keep that, I don't know. And now what I do is stretch them out. When I first saw some of the pots in Japan, I kind of really couldn't understand them. Some of them incredibly, especially some of the Mino ones, and the Oribe, kind of very sort of horseshoe-shaped tea bowls. Very kind of wobbly and half collapsed sometimes, and I kind of, you know, they were kind of, I couldn't quite understand them. This is a national living treasure, this piece. How is that? But I think it took me some time to really absorb that and see how special those pots were. And there's one particular pot that has never left my frontal lobe. It was a Shino pot tea bowl with the most incredible glaze on it. It was a white sugary glaze with this red coming up, if you can imagine it, underneath the glaze itself. So somehow you could see this red underneath the white, and yet the white was quite thick and sugary. Made by Toizo Arakawa. And it just blew my mind, you know. It was just such an amazing pot. And I think it wasn't necessarily the form, it was just the whole thing together.
and that really got me hooked on Shinos. I'd already started looking at them before I went to Japan, but I think seeing some of the Japanese Shinos, you know, we'd been much more exposed to sort of more the American style Shino, but seeing the Japanese Shinos, these wonderful colours, some of them incredibly quiet with just little red edges and things, I just thought they were incredible. And made out of such simple materials, just feldspar and just a little clay, that's all. And that really appealed to my sense of simplicity in the way that I do my glazing. You know, soda glaze is so simple, really, you know. Well, it's not, the firing is actually quite complicated, but in essence, you're using very, very simple materials, just clay, just a slip, which is just clay, you know, and two types of clay mixed together, and then the fire. And, you know, Shinos are similar. It's how you fire them that makes them interesting and creates the colours that we get. And the combinations of that, it makes, I can't tell you how much of a difference it makes. I was very lucky to meet a very old guy, Shino glaze maker. I didn't realise that, in fact, in Japan, a lot of people don't make their own glazes. There are specialists for that. They're often clay makers as well. And we went to visit this guy, Mr. Kumagai, who was already in his 90s by that time. Very optimistic man, though, because he was just building a new place, a new workshop, and or new clay making place, and in his 90s. So he obviously wasn't going anywhere at the time. And he actually makes fantastic Shinos. But you can't really bring those materials back. So, you know, I thought, well, I have to find my own voice, really. And so I have to use the materials that are available here. Saying that, some of them are imported from North Cape and from Canada and all the rest of it, but I have to work with what's with me here. And, you know, try to find my own voice in that. I don't want to really replicate Japanese pots or Japanese glazes, but I'm heavily influenced by it, obviously. And, you know, so it's just trying to find your own voice. And of course, I fire them in a soda kiln, so it gives them a completely different look. And also the way that I fire them when I don't fire them is again very different from the way they do in Japan. They do incredibly long firings. I think Ken does, with his Shinos in the gas kiln, fires them for 9 days. And some of the Shino kilns I've seen in Japan have walls that are, you know, 8 or 10 feet thick, so that they cool very slowly. Well, I don't, you know, I don't have that facility at the moment to do that. So I adapt it to do, you know, something interesting for me. And it's something that is always, I'm always moving on with, and I'm always growing with and looking for different ways of firing these things. And it's, you know, it's just quite incredible actually how, you know, just doing something in the firing will make a complete difference to how the end product comes out. You know, it still amazes me, really. I moved down to Devon 3 years ago, and Darren Ellis was at the time just about starting his apprenticeship. I couldn't have done it without him, actually. I mean, he's incredibly strong and incredibly skilled in lots of ways, and not just making pots, but he's really skilled all-rounder. We built a kiln and then you know, set up the studio, set up all sorts of things, master classes, all kind of things. And Darren has now finished his apprenticeship. He worked with me for a good 2 years, really. One of the advantages of being an apprentice really is the fact that you get to meet people. You see how it all works. You see the good bits and the bad bits, actually. You see all of it, and you may think, well, I won't be doing it like that. You get the whole picture. You know, you see how the accounts, how to handle people on the phone, you know, when they're ordering, how to get out to the shows, and of course, you know, when they're with you, working with you, they meet all the people that are running the show, so they're already known to them when they come to apply themselves, which must help. So I think it's really important for lots of reasons, not just learning how to make the pots. It's the whole business, actually, because that's what we potters do now. We have to market ourselves, we have to You know, we have to order the clay, we have to do, you know, making the pots, we have to fire the pots, we have to build, you know, make the glazes. There's so much involved in it. And you have to be an all-rounder. I mean, we can't be good at everything, but, you know, we have to try and be all-rounders in that. When we add the soda, it's a long period of spraying soda in for 3 hours at a time, 2 of us usually, to get in enough. And that has to circulate around the kiln. And you learn to work with the areas in the kiln. There are always dry patches in a soda kiln. It's just, you just can't avoid it really. So I use those patches for putting in the chinos because they don't want too much. They need a little to give them that red colour. But they don't want too much. So I quite like that now, that I can mix the different glazes in the same firing and use those sheltered spots. A bit like people used to put, you know, a lower temperature glaze in an area in a kiln that under fires, you know. It's much the same, using those areas to your advantage. I've kind of always been quite keen on experimenting with that. Different ways of finishing the firing, different ways of introducing the soda, different ways of reduction at certain periods. But it's quite a difficult thing really, because you're risking huge amounts of pots sometimes, and especially when I used to do it in my 100 cubic foot kiln, you know. But I'm quite lucky to have got away with, you know, quite a lot of pots really. But I think what happens is that when you do that kind of experimentation, there's always something interesting comes out of it. Because you've done something different, it may not be what you expected, but because you've fired slightly differently, it makes a huge difference. And you know, you can sometimes get, you know, a dozen or so pots out that are incredibly different. And I think if you look through my body of work for the exhibition, actually, that you'll see, you know, there's difference, the same glaze, but because I've fired it differently, it's completely different. Some of them are really lustered, some of them are quite matte, some of them are, you know, have gold luster on, you know. That comes from very late reduction. So, you know, completely different ways of firing gives you what is basically slips and a chino reacting in numerous different ways. So, you know, when we fire with soda, of course, I'm firing the chinos in the soda kiln. Of course, it twigged a little while later that it's a bit like firing them in a wood kiln because you've got that added flux. So, in a way, it's quite useful to do it in a soda kiln. If you're just firing in a gas kiln with no extra flux in there, they react again very differently. I think, you know, I've always been blessed with a fair amount of energy, but you know, it's a pretty hard life sometimes, you know, working that hard. And, you know, I often used to work 7 days a week, you know, having to. Not just financially, but, you know, to try and, you know, get things going and get things right. And I can't say I've always got it right. You know, I think, you know, I've sometimes worked far too hard. And, you know, and you have to sort of remember, you know, that you have to get out there and do some other things sometimes. You know, I think my saving grace has always been having a dog, getting out and walking in the park and chatting to people, and having children, of course. You know, you have to, you can't just ignore them. So, you know, it means that you do get out and do stuff with them. And I think that's important, actually. It is important. I did have quite a chunk of time teaching, and I taught in lots of colleges around London and different places. And it wasn't till Goldsmiths closed in 1994 that I actually started setting up my own studio again. So I found, again, looking for a building that would be suitable, and I came across this old ticket office at Maze Hill, and approached Rail Track, and eventually they let me have it. But it was completely derelict. I mean, we walked through the door and went through the floor. It hadn't been used for many years. And we had no outside space. It was all banked up, but we actually got diggers in there. That was quite some day, actually, when we got the digger. I really thought, what have you bitten off? You've bitten off far more than you can chew now. So we had, I think, 10, 18-ton lorry loads of soil removed. It was huge with a digger. So, but then we made a space and we put down a plinth and started to build a kiln. We used to fire in the dead of night, so we weren't sort of, causing havoc during the day. But I think we got some very strange looks from the police. They used to back their cars up and, what's going on here? But they're very good. They sort of left me alone. Probably after about a year and a half of being there. It's very hard work running all that situation, and we were teaching, which became very popular. One of my ex-colleagues was now working at Medway, my old college, and said, I've got a fantastic Japanese student down here, and she'd really look for some experience, so perhaps you could take her on. And Yo Tom came to me, and she started working at weekends. It was great working with her. I really realised what a fantastic opportunity it was for me as much as anything. I was learning about Japanese culture and all sorts of things, and food, very importantly. Actually, it was an ex-student from Camberwell who was doing a work placement with us in the summer. And I said, maybe we should set up some sort of charity. And she said, it's like being adopted, isn't it? You could adopt them. So I said, well, there you go, fantastic, adopt a potter. And it was just sort of spawn out of that conversation, really. It started off with a few of us just donating pots and raffling them. And then we had the idea to go to Hatfield and see if we could really do sort of a tombola thing and get everybody involved. And I think it's been very successful. With the demise of the colleges and ceramics colleges closing down, I mean, Goldsmiths was the first, pretty well, and since then many have gone. I was really very disheartened by this and feeling that really it's the only way we can go is actually to sort of set back into apprenticeships again until those in power begin to realise what's missing in those colleges and that we actually need to put them back in. The thing about having good pots is using them in your everyday life. It's half the pleasure, really. Of course we start with the mug, and I think even people who don't buy handmade mugs will often have a favourite mug. So you're making decisions about what you choose to eat your cereal out of, be it, sadly, I hope it's not IKEA or one of those things, but you're making a decision about the size, the form, what's comfortable when you're half asleep, what do you want to drink your tea out of and eat your cereal out of. And I think when you buy handmade pots, you can get such a lot of pleasure out of that. And I think those sort of things are important in life, actually. Okay. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, this is one we made in 2 parts, and then it has slip, and then we put some ash on the top just before it goes in. Yeah, I'm quite happy with that. Got a little run here. This area here is quite scorched. It's obviously got some carbon trapping here, but that again gives you another layer of character. If it was all like that, it might be not so interesting. It's got it here too, just carbon trapping underneath, which you sometimes get in the corner of the kiln here because you're restricting the flow. So you can make these things work for you. This is quite interesting to look at, pots that can be, you've got it right and you've got it right in the right spot, where you've got this one's got a lot of interest in it and the chino's worked. In contrast to having, a teapot that's totally in the wrong space. This was a red chino one and it's been blasted, so we've lost all the colour. It's not beautiful. It's very, very rare to get probably 80% out even. Especially with the kind of firing that I'm doing, I don't tend to, I'm not looking for uniformity, so, you have to work with that and have to expect the losses. I don't have many of my own pots in my house. I have some nice seconds and things like that. You have to sell the good ones. I'm quite good at letting go of pots. I mean, I really, it's hard when you unpack a kiln and the pots go straight away. I do like to have them about so I can do exactly what I said, noticing, you know, that's worked or whatever. So it's quite a wrench to let those things go very quickly. And I have a lot of other people's pots which must have an influence on me. I don't think it's very directly, so I don't see a bowl and think, oh, I'll make that shape. It's something subtle in that. Again, I'm noticing something very subtle in it, the way it handles or something in the rim. I mean, I recently bought a tea bowl in Korea, actually made by a potter from Mashiko. Wow, I just remember sitting there looking at it on the shelf and just seeing this, the way the rim turns over. And maybe somebody else wouldn't have noticed, you know, but for me, the softness of that rim on that tea bowl just made that pot. And that came home with me. It's little subtle things that affect me, and I try, you know, I might try and put that softness of rim. I'll never achieve it the way that he's done it, but it'll be there in my mind when I'm making something. I might remember that, and that will affect my work. So it's not like I see a Hamada and I want to make a Hamada, or I see, you know, a Tozo Arakawa and I want to make one of those. It's something in that foot ring or something in the Hamada, you know, the way the glazes drip will affect me. So it's not very direct, my influences. When you're making something large, or even it doesn't have to be large, but you know, there's something about letting the clay respond to itself. And I think you're never going to see it spinning around on a wheel anyway, but to see an edge slightly off-centre is much more interesting actually than it's sort of looking at something that's absolutely perfect. For me, that's true in pots. I think it's not true of everything, but I think in pots, for me, you know, I want to see something with a bit of energy, a bit of life to it, and keeping it so it's kind of it's got its own spirit, really. I think you run the risk, I think, with that kind of thing, though, is to, you know, some work and some don't, and it's knowing that when everything comes together, when the firing comes together and the glazing comes together and the making comes together. Some of my best pots where the glaze actually isn't perfect, it's been a sort of a happy accident. It's chance, really, and equally with the making too. You know, things that I've just done and thought, oh, that's interesting, I'll leave that. You know, when those things all come together, you know, you get a real special pot, real spirited pot, and that's the kind of pots I aim to make. You know, I hope to achieve in my life, you know, even if I just make a few, I'll be happy.
We need to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
There's nothing forced, and I think his jogs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.